Most people who drive Highways D and 94 every day give little thought to the history of the area. After all, getting to work on time and coming home as quickly as possible are generally not activities that would cause a person to consider what happened long ago in the area he is driving through. Sometimes, however, it's hard not to notice some pretty unusual sights along the road. What is that monument over there all about? Is it some sort of historical marker? Why is there a cemetery back there in the woods? Are all of these daffodils along the road part of a highway beautification project? What is that retaining wall doing there, with those steps that lead nowhere? Stopping the car and looking, though, provides more questions than answers. For the person willing to hike the woods between Weldon Spring and Defiance, in the Weldon Spring and Busch conservation areas, puzzling discoveries will abound. What are all these non-native flowers doing out here in the middle of the woods? How did this bottle end up on this hillside? A well in the middle of the forest? This looks like the steps to the front door, but where's the house to go with it? This is the short answer to these questions. In 1941, the U.S. government purchased 18,000 acres to build a munitions plant here. About 750 people, many of whom lived on small family farms, were forced to sell their homes and leave. After the war, they were never given the opportunity to return. The munitions plant, which eventually was used to process uranium, is now safely buried under this mound. The people who left in 1941, though, did not vanish without a trace. If a person is willing to look carefully and perhaps do some bushwhacking, evidence of these old family farms can still be found, and many small family cemeteries await discovery. A good place to begin is at the Lost Valley Trailhead on Highway 94. Much of this trail follows the old road that ran from Highway 94 to the small town of Howell, one of the villages removed by the government in 1941. It is a beautiful walk. The Muscheni Cemetery is situated on a small hill overlooking a creek. Only Muschenis are buried here. It looks today much as it did 65 years ago when the government erected this barbed wire fence and gate. John Muscheni was a Civil War veteran. Catherine Muscheni was 3 years old when she died in 1876. Her grave is highly unusual because it faces not east, but south. This puzzle is typical of the mysteries these cemeteries provide. The old road along Little Femme Osage Creek soon passes by the farm owned by Edward Gocke in 1941. These forsythia bushes still bloom every spring in what was once a front yard. Beautiful wildflowers like these would have been enjoyed for many generations by the pioneer families in this area. This spring has probably satisfied many a thirsty traveler over the years. The Dunlap Cemetery is located just south of the former site of Howell. It contains one of the oldest graves in the area. Melinda McFall died in 1840. Her grave marker is still legible. This is the grave of Carolyn Dunlap. Her marker states she was a relict. That simply means she was the wife of a minister. Not surprisingly, headstones often tell sad stories. Rufus Gamble Dunlap died in 1879 at the age of 6 months. His parents, no doubt in the midst of tremendous grief, erected this stone. It reads, "A bud transplanted to bloom forever in the paradise of God." Many families were poor, so unmarked stones were commonly used. The hillside next to this cemetery is awash with yellow floods of daffodils. Hikers and cyclists are treated to a burst of spring color. A few thousand feet to the east, on a long steep ridge, which an old road traverses, is what remains of a farm once owned by Mary Winterberg. Although only rubble and some foundation stones remain of the buildings, the narcissus and bridal wreath, which greeted travelers in the spring, is still in evidence. And, of course, the old farm pond is still here. On this spring day, it is full of frog eggs. The Scott Cemetery is located on this property. According to 1941 newspaper articles, it is an African American cemetery and slaves are buried here. No marked headstones are here, but this old Mushaney funeral home marker is still legible. A few hundred feet to the east and just south of the old road is a farm owned by Eliza Teeters in 1941. The house is long gone, other than for the suggestion of a cellar, but the ground is still littered with interesting artifacts. A bed frame, a pan, a galvanized tub, 2 cross-cut saw blades, the fence around the yard, a stash of liquor bottles, a gasoline can, some kind of strainer, another tub, and yet another cross-cut saw blade. A second African American cemetery is just to the east, about a mile west of the site of Hamburg, another village which no longer exists. This is the McRoberts Cemetery. Like the Scott Cemetery, it has no engraved headstones, but plenty of unmarked ones. As is the case with all of these cemeteries, it is easy to imagine people coming here in their grief to bury their loved ones. The old road now slopes to a narrow creek and approaches the former Schneider farm in Upper Hamburg. The house was at the southern edge of this hill. The cemetery is across the crest to the north. This farm was still owned by the Schneiders in 1941, so it had been in the same family for many generations. This is the grave of the family patriarch, Heinrich Schneider. Schneider came from Germany to New Orleans in 1839 and arrived in Hamburg the following year. In 1849, Schneider went to the gold fields of California with 7 area men to seek his fortune. Nearly 2 years later they returned, each man about $10,000 richer. Just to the east of the old Schneider place is the Mattis Cemetery. This cemetery is literally within a stone's throw of Highway 94. The fence is still beautiful. George Mattis was born in Germany and came to America in the 1830s. In 1837, he married Catherine Schneider. Mattis died only 28 years later at the age of 54. His wife survived him by 37 years, but never remarried. In labor and in love allied, in death they here sleep side by side, resting in peace the aged twain, until Christ shall raise them up again. About a quarter of a mile north on Highway 94 is the site of the Hamburg schoolhouse. A few hundred feet to the west is the Murdoch Cemetery. In 1941, 5 bodies were removed to Oak Grove Cemetery in St. Charles, along with the grave monuments. The concrete supports for the monuments are still visible. The Murdoch Cemetery is a favorite destination for geocachers. They remove the booklet from the container, sign their names, cover the container, and depart. They seem to treat the cemetery with the utmost respect. Back at the site of the Hamburg School, The walk continues down the old road to Lower Hamburg. This scenic walk leads down to the Missouri River and the location of the Hamburg Depot on what is now the Katy Trail. An old quarry is situated along the road. The Richard Pittman Cemetery overlooks the river and is only a few yards from the Katy Trail, yet cyclists and hikers are unaware of its existence. This was once a larger cemetery, but the only remaining grave is that of Richard Pittman, who was born in 1784. Sacred to the memory of Richard Pittman. On the way back up the road is the farm owned by Hattie Mattis in 1941. A tall cedar tree marks the front yard. It appears this home had a large cellar. It also had a concrete front porch. The cistern cover here resembles a beehive. Immediately adjacent to this home is the Roth-Heck Cemetery. It is a beautiful, quiet spot in the springtime. The unfortunate victim of vandalism over the years, it now contains only about half of the headstones once placed here. Philip Heck was a regimental musician in the Civil War. This homemade stone simply says, Mary. About a mile north of this cemetery, on a long narrow ridge which parallels Highway 94, the 1941 farm of Daniel McDonald hides in the woods. This farm had a very long and narrow outbuilding made up of two connecting wings. It had a large furnace in the middle, and its floors were concrete. What could it have been used for? Off the side of the ridge is a small ravine where trash was thrown. Most of the small farms in the area used ravines for this purpose. These spots are great places to find old bottles and other artifacts. A car fender, CB Soda, bottled in St. Louis by the Coca-Cola Bottling Company. St. Louis Dairy Company. A part of the radiator? A large tree has recently fallen on the foundation of the house. Only a few feet from the house is a cistern. It is still full of clear, cold water. Near the house is another outbuilding next to a collapsed cistern. Many old items await discovery in the yard. What is this? Here's the top, and here's the bottom. Now it's time to visit the Busch Conservation Area, where more old farms and cemeteries can be found. The Porter Cemetery is almost directly across the road from the larger and better known Francis Howell Cemetery. It contains only 3 graves. On this day, a snake suns itself on the cemetery's old cedar tree. He seems to be enjoying himself. Long ago, before a dam was built, this lake was just a stream. Overlooking the stream was the costly cemetery. Othaniel Costley and Cordelia Keithley were married in the early 1850s. Costley died in 1871 when he was kicked in the stomach by a sheep. His wife ran the farm without her husband until she died 33 years later. Their grandson, Font Costley, did not survive infancy and is buried near his grandparents. When Font's father, Uncas Costley, died decades later in 1949. He requested that his body be cremated and the ashes spread on Font's grave. The location of the costly home is in the trees across the lake. The Schlode property and cemetery are accessed by crossing this old bridge. Beavers are still at work here. This farm was still in the Schlode family in 1941. The remnants of many buildings are still visible. Crepe myrtle grows in abundance here. These are the steps to the front door. At one time, the Schlode Cemetery overlooked Schlode Creek, but the creek was dammed, and trees and brush now surround the cemetery. This is the grave of the first Schlode to live here, Andreas, who was born in 1798. Both George and Auguste Schlode fought in the Civil War. Each man has a designation of the Veterans Organization, the Grand Army of the Republic, carved into his headstone. The last cemetery in the August Busch Conservation Area is the William Price Cemetery. It is at the crest of a small hill, only a few hundred feet from one of the many gravel roads in the area. Nearly all the graves here are marked with rough, unhewn stones. This is the grave of Julia Smith. It is not attached to its base because no base for it can be found in the cemetery. To this date, no record of her burial in this cemetery or any other in the area has been found. According to oral tradition, this cedar stump marks someone's final resting place. It once had 3 nails driven into it. One of those nails remains. The hiking trail that follows the old Howell Ferry Road wanders from Highway 94 down to the Missouri River. This is always a peaceful place to walk. Beautiful plants like this fern cover the banks. At one point, several old cedar trees line the road on the farm owned by Kenneth Bitting in 1941. The old fence is still visible, although the trees have consumed some of it. The Daniel Cemetery is a short distance down this road. 2 of its headstones are engraved in German. About 1/2 mile away is the Hutchings Cemetery. At one time, this cemetery was only a few hundred feet from the road, but since all traces of that road are long gone, the cemetery now seems to be in the middle of nowhere. The most interesting structure in all of these family cemeteries is the stone enclosure located here. According to oral tradition, it might mark the graves of 2 children. No one, however, will ever know for sure. Someone spent many hours squaring these corners and leveling these walls. These large flat stones on the top of the walls are full of interesting fossils. Who knows what grief built this? Here is another mystery in this cemetery. This structure has the same carefully squared stones, but is much smaller. Next to it rests 2 very large flat stones. This is supposed to be the grave of William Pittman. Yet another mystery is the location of the headstone belonging to this footstone. Milton Lewis was buried here before the Civil War, but his headstone has disappeared. This cemetery has about 35 unmarked stones. Today, we find one more. Unfortunately, it has split into 5 pieces. Years ago, this stone sank into the ground, and a slender, young tree root grew over it. Now that larger and older root holds the stone firmly below ground. These are the kinds of wonderful discoveries awaiting anyone willing to take a walk in the Weldon Spring and August Busch conservation areas. The challenge, of course, is to take the time to turn off the road, pull on some hiking boots, grab a compass, and begin the journey of discovery.